AT devices to enhance speech and communication. So in this chapter, in Chapter 5 of your textbook, we talk about several aspects: the nature of spoken language, nature of augmentative communication, and the textbook describes various devices to enhance communication. So the first thing that we need to go over is the parts of spoken language. So your textbook notes that the most rudimentary level or definition of oral language is the act of speaking and listening. There are other parts of spoken language. So we have listening, speaking, semantics, syntax, morphology, phonology, and pragmatics. Your text defines listening as not just hearing, but more so to do with decoding kinds of words and structures. Such items as numbers of words, types of words, nouns, syntax structures, etc. are what we use to assess how well an individual has a capacity to listen. Really, when we talk about the following structures of language, we're really talking about them in terms of how we assess them within a deficit model. So how we look for errors, or how we look for deficits within certain areas of spoken language. Speaking then becomes the examination, again towards assessment, the examination of production. So the number of words that are said, the type of words that are used, and the type of sentence structures that are used by the individual. So the example here is that within speech pathology and production of words, the idea, structure, and syntax might be there, but the frustration might be that the individual can't produce the sounds because of facial musculature or lack of certain structures within the mouth, certain physiological issues with the tongue, for instance, roof of mouth, etc. So there's that frustration that you can't actually produce it, even though the idea is there, the structure is there, and you know how to piece together the language to make sense. Semantics refers to the meaningfulness of language, including words, so vocabulary, chunks of words, so phrases, and continuous text, such as sentences and paragraphs. This is important to augmentative and alternative communication because meaning sometimes can have a very large limitation. So the example that I traditionally give is that imagine a child with autism who is nonverbal, who doesn't have the capacity to produce oral language, and we have the child on some kind of picture system to show what they want or what they need. Well, you can imagine that we have to have certain vagaries or overlaps in meanings of, for instance, beverage, I want to drink something, without having exactly what the drink is appear on every card, because if we put specifics on every card, in a card system or picture book system, the child would inevitably wind up with files and files and files, or a filing cabinet full of pictures that he needs to sort through and pull out to actually show exactly what he wants. So in this case, we probably do trial and error. The child shows a picture of something to drink that denotes the drinking card, and then the person asks, do you want this, do you want that, do you want coffee, do you want water, until we get the correct answer. Syntax is the way we string together words to make cohesive sense. So in the following example, the red big apple was juicy. The red big apple was juicy. It's not as cohesive in terms of syntax as the big red apple was juicy. If we jumble them up and we take the example further and use exactly the same string of words, but in a different order, you'll see that the syntax makes no sense whatsoever. We lose meaning altogether. Juicy, the red, was apple big. So you don't know whether you're referring to size, what you're referring to in terms of the context, whether we're describing color, whether we're actually talking about an apple, or we're creating a metaphor here. So it's very important to assess syntax to see how well that structure is in place to lend towards alternative and augmentative communication. Morphology is the examination of the smallest unit of speech that have meaning, so how well an individual uses morphology. So we look at unbound morphemes, that is, words that stand by themselves and have meaning. So girl, for instance, we can all picture what a girl looks like. Bound morphemes, like s, must be bound to derive meaning. They have to be bound to an unbound morpheme to actually make meaning. So girl plus s, because s by itself doesn't make any sense, has to be bound together to make girls, of which we can actually conjure up an image of. It's important to OGCOMM in terms of analyzing semantic proficiency. So these are smaller errors in terms of semantics. Phonology deals with the sound system of language. It's important to OGCOMM because most users have weak or no phonological skills. The devices produce phonemes and string them together. So if we look at synthesized language, like the way Dr. Hawking, he talks through the hardware that synthesizes his speech, what we do is we string together little bits of language. So pro would be used for the word production, would be used for proactive. We'd reuse that little phoneme all together over and over again with whatever word is being produced that has PRO in it. Now it's different than digital language, which would be an exact digital copy of each word that's produced. So it would be a different person saying, for instance, product, proactive. They'd be saying it differently. So you wouldn't have that weird kind of sound that it's stringing together phonemes within digital language. Pragmatics refers to, in terms of assessment again, the level of complexity of language used to achieve a specific purpose. So how complex the language is that the individual is using. If you want to, you can go to this lecture and you can test out your language proficiency from some of the structures that we talk about of language. So you can take a look at that and get a rating. And you'll see that it's a little bit different because it's British English that's being used as a context for the test. So you'll actually see that there's a difference in your proficiency than what you would have in terms of North American English. So what are augmentative and alternative communication systems? Well, AAC is defined as an area of clinical practice that attempts to compensate for the impairment and desirable patterns of individuals with expressive disorders. So the idea is they lack some type of proficiency in putting together language, and we try to bridge that gap because it really does look at a deficit model. So this does not mean that the goal is not to develop oral language skills, but to establish a system meant to add to existing abilities. The idea here is there's a concern that if we give a child a tool like something that speaks for them, this magical black box of speech synthesis, that they're going to not want to develop or not have the urge to develop oral language by themselves if that structure is possible. Your textbook takes the stand that AAC does not inhibit speech development. It takes away the pressure and frustration of ineffective communication and social interaction. So imagine not being able to speak at all, and you have this tool that's possible to use, and we don't give it to you. So I think you'd probably be highly frustrated at the fact that you can't get your thoughts out, you can't get your ideas out. Again, drawing back on Dr. Hawking, I mean, He's one of the most brilliant minds on the planet. Imagine if he couldn't get those ideas out. There's three functions of an AAC system. One is it can substitute for vocality or orality, so being a substitute for being able to produce oral speech. So it's transmitting information through nonverbal means, like speech synthesis, like gestural language, like sign languages too. It can also act as a supplement to vocal communication. So, for instance, if I have an individual that slurs some of his words, has a very difficult time with some of the words, he might be able to sign some of those, might be able to simply write it down on a piece of paper and show what he means. In working with individuals with Alzheimer's, in a prior life of mine, when we get on to the later stages of Alzheimer's, it's very difficult for some individuals to be able to understand what the individual with Alzheimer's is trying to actually say. So in this instance, we'd use some type of alternative communication system, like writing it down on paper, like a flashcard if it's a word that's frequent, that gets around that issue, communicates efficiently. It can also be a facilitator of communication, so something that actually organizes language. If we look at Dr. Hawking's speech synthesis communication system, he actually strings together words, and common phrases are auto-generated for him to select from within his computer that's mounted onto his wheelchair. So in this case, this alternative communication system, it's actually helping him organize language easier, so he can string it together and efficiently produce it quicker. Unaided communication refers to communication systems that do not involve the use of external equipment or devices. So things like gestural languages, like sign language, and gestural language codes, as well as educational sign systems. Aided communication, on the other hand, uses equipment and or devices to provide people with the ability to communicate. So something as simple as a page full of pictures that communicate what the individual needs, to something as complex as stringing together language and having it synthesized out through some device. So if we talk about things like symbol books to picture books to get communication across, communication boards, etc., we have to talk about a couple of features of what makes up those particular assistive technology devices. So pictures or symbols can be used to represent ideas. Symbols can vary in level, though. So we need to talk about abstraction, style, and size. So in terms of the abstraction of symbols, we go from simple to complex. A simple abstraction, right, would be a true representation of the person, place, or thing. So if we're dealing with a child and they want their mother and they need to point to what they want, the most simple representation of mom is pointing at her across the room, and it's the real physical mom. If we work our way down to more complex, to interpretation, we could use a full-size picture of mom, then a smaller picture of mom, then a drawing of a woman holding a child's hand that slightly denotes the idea of motherly love. All the way to the point that we get to text, so MOM or MOMMY, this letter system that we've created for ourselves, right? This alphabet, this symbol system that we've created as a species. We've created something very complex. So that would be the most difficult thing to decode. That would be language, right? So we can look at abstraction of symbols from a true representation of the individual, if we're talking about mom, all the way through the letters MOM, something very difficult to learn, very difficult to decode. Style. Well, style should be driven for maximum functionality, should be user-driven. The idea here, though, is if the individual can't deal with a certain level of abstraction, we might have to use concrete pictures, so clips from magazines, actual pictures from home, for the individual to understand that those are what we're talking about, those are what they're showing that they need at that particular time. Size, it depends also on the individual, obviously on visual impairments or visual disabilities, as well as motor disabilities. So the idea is to allow maximum vocabulary and communication on a communication board. We usually choose something that's 1 to 2 inch squares, and using programs like BoardMaker, they create a fairly standard sized button from their templates, but you can modify that as well to create a communication board. So there are several different selection techniques for aided communication systems. Again, it's driven by the user's functional limitations. So if they have good motor functioning, then they can use direct selection, which in essence means being able to point in some form, either using a mouth pointer, so that's really a stick in one's mouth, using a head pointer, which is a stick mounted to one's head, or being able to use one's fingers, or even being able to gaze at an object and assessing where the person's looking. If not, then we have to use some form of scanning method. So direct selection really requires pointing and the mobility to do so. So we can use things, like I said, to select the desired object by finger pointing, by head pointing, or by using an eye gaze pointing system. We choose scanning for individuals that can't direct select. So what we're asking for is some form of reaction or facial cue to their choice when the scanner gets to the desired icon in a row or in a column. So electronic scanning devices, they sequence through a series of symbols or objects, highlighting visually to make audible, and the user would select by timing or switch. So imagine your mouse on your computer being a switch. You click on it to activate something. You don't have the capacity, though, to be able to point or focus to that level of pointing to something on your computer screen. So if we have, say, the numbers 2, 4, 6, 8 on your computer screen, and electronically it's highlighting and flashing 2, then 4, then 6, then 8, and you hit your mouse button when you want it to stop, that's really what scanning is. It's scanning through a list of items that you can choose from, and then you're hitting a switch, or you're making a sound, and we have switches that act on sound that stop or start when somebody makes a sound. So that would be scanning and using switches. Scanning can be a row column in terms of organization. It can be linear or it can be rotary. So it's just how we organize the sequencing of events. We can also talk about non-electric systems. Well, the benefit is they're flexible and inexpensive. So things like non-electric communication boards, so a piece of paper, piece of poster board, etc., that have images that are taped, or pictures that are taped to it or glued to it, usually with words attached to it, so the child gets used to associating language, written language, together with the particular icon they're using. And then they point at them to get their message across of what they need. We could talk about things like non-electric mini boards, so that's just a smaller version of a communication board. Communication books, so pictures in a book that the individual points at. And eye gaze displays. Well, an eye gaze display would be a piece of, say, about 4x4 plexiglass that's mounted on a base that sits between the teacher and the individual. And we'd say write on both sides of that plexiglass, that clear plastic glass, answers to questions that we're going to ask the child. So again, 2468, if the individual doesn't have oral language and the individual can say only move their eyes, you can ask them what's 2 times 2, and they would gaze, they would look at the number 4 on the plexiglass. You being on the other side would be able to assess that they're looking at the right answer. Electronic devices, they have some disadvantages of the fact that they cost more, there is maintenance involved, and there can sometimes be issues of portability depending on their size. The advantage, though, is the individual gets much more of a sense of independent use from using them, and there is built-in reinforcement. So we can look at some types of electric devices. So for instance, membrane boards. So if you've ever gone to an ATM machine and they don't have buttons, but they have kind of a plastic sheet across the keyboard that you're typing in your PIN number, etc., kind of like little bubbles under plastic, that's a membrane board. These are advantageous because individuals sometimes drool, or if secretions get on them, they don't get destroyed, whereas if you have buttons, things can crawl inside the buttons, liquid can, and then destroy what's going on. For instance, if you drop a cup of coffee on your keyboard, it's going to cease to function. You can also use things like optical pointing, like the head mouse that I've discussed previously with you. If you want to take a look at one particular scanning device that's electronic, you can go to this URL and you can take a look at it in action. If we talk about the difference between synthesized and digital voice, which I've kind of touched on, again, it's the difference between stringing phonemes together, little bits of language, and reusing them, compared to having a true recording of each word in a vocabulary for an individual to use. Now this could be a recording of some individual's voice, which is used by the other individual when they string together language and produce digital language. The new version of Dragon Naturally Speaking allows you to actually digitalize your own voice as it records for you and transcribes what you're saying, and it can actually read back your material in your own voice.